Now that we've finished our sanding, we're ready to transfer. We're going to use a one-shot connector here, and we've got the glue plate on it. We went ahead and put a pyramid on. And what happens with this setup is that now it allows you to fill that up with the Coyote Quick and drop your lock into your alignment wherever you may want it. And it will bond that to the one shot, and you're ready to laminate onto it. So we'll fill that channel up. We'll drop our lock body in there. As you can see, it's offset. And I'm going to take a peek around there and make sure I don't have any voids. And I've got a small one there on the back where it's offset. So I'm going to go ahead and fill that in a little bit. You really don't want any air pockets in here. It's just a place for resin to build up, and then air might seep out of that when you laminate, and you'll get air for no reason in your lamination. You're not sure where it comes from, but it could possibly come from areas like that. Now we're all set, and we're ready to take this out of the transfer jig and go laminate it. A lot of times a person will disconnect from where they are on their transfer jig, lift their cast off, still have their pyramid hooked on with all 4 screws in it. You always have the potential, if those are too tight, when you take those off, breaking your lock loose from whatever you're glued to, especially like a BK with a PVA bag. So, quick little tech tip, take your pyramid and loosen the screws now. I didn't have mine in very tight to start with, but it's easy to over tighten those. Maybe get a screw bound up in one. So, I'm going to loosen all 4 of these first on my pyramid. Now, I'll loosen up my little stack connector that I used to hold my pyramid. Make sure they're backed out really nice. Loosen up my jig, and this should lift straight off. Now that I've got them all loose, very easily removed. I put no stress on where I've glued my lock in. You can break that loose, your lock loose, by torquing on those. So I like to do it as much as I can on my transfer jig and then come over here. Now we've got our glue plate on here. We want to remove that. Whoop. No big deal. Our glue plate pops right off. Now our glue is right where it needs to be on our one shot or alignable 4, either one. They might have a little different glue plate, but it does the same thing. Everything's nice and level through there. This allows you to lay your 1-inch strapping through for reinforcement. Okay, so now we're going to get our lamination tooling and put on here for our easy off lock. Make sure our orientation is the correct way for our lever. If that's how it's going to be when it's finished, then we want to make sure we put this on that direction so it looks just like it. If you've got somebody who wants to pull from anterior to posterior, fine. You can put it on the other way, but in this application, we're going like that. First thing I like to do is get a little more of my Dow Corning Compound 4, some kind of a release agent. The wax would probably work. I like to hit my O-ring a little bit, back of my plastic, do the sides. It just makes it easier to release when you have to pull this piece out of your lamination. Once again, we're using epoxy resins, which bond to things much harder than modified acrylics. Metal, plastic, everything. I'm gonna clean my hands off. We don't want to get that Compound 4 all over our lock because the whole idea is to make that bite to it. And I want to put a little of my Compound 4 on each one of my screws. Once again, we're laminating, and it's always a good idea if something is threaded to put a release agent on it. We'll set that in place. Get our first screw in. I don't put it in tight, I just run it in close. I want to get a nice level compression of my tooling piece. When I go to suck all those screws down, you do want to put all 4 of them in. You can see I'm just cranking them in there without killing them. It holds that flatter up against it. You don't get any kind of weird torquing effect. Now I'll go around and feel them. Got a little more of the same tension on all 4. You notice I didn't turn this sideways and try to wench on that and over tighten them. Just run them down there nice and snug. That's all there is to that. So I like taking a little bit of clay, and I want to hit all 5 of my holes. Definitely want to hit my screw head holes. I do not like cleaning resin out of these things. If you do happen to get it in there, get a heat gun and warm it up. then take a pick and pick it out. I also like to hit that 5th hole in the middle, which we use later when we run our grabber screw in and pull this tooling piece out. Makes it a lot easier to put that screw in there. Keeps you from having to re-drill it. It's already a pre-drilled hole. Now I'll put a little bit of compound 4 on my finger. We'll hit the face of this again. A little on the sides, staying away from our lock, body. There we go. Now we're ready to laminate. The way we're going to laminate this, we're going to try to make it flexible with this plastic on the inside. I'm going to use 4 layers of Flex-A-Stretch, which means I'll pull the first one on, I'll tie it off here in my ring and deflect it. I'll put another one on, tie it off, deflect it. Then I'll take my Coyote composite braid and I'll bring it around about, say, the distal third-ish and tie it off, and then I'll deflect it. So I'll have 1 full layer right about here. I'll have 2 layers over my connector, 2 layers over my lock, and I'll have just 1 full layer running the full length of this, and we'll see what we get with 1 layer of Coyote composite on our brim area and 4 Flex-A-Stretch, which is a real light nylon. It's not very heavy at all. This Flex-A-Stretch comes from Cascade. Good product. There's my first layer. We'll go ahead and tie that off in our ring, which is in the 1-shot connector right there. Deflect our other layer over. Right here, where we come over this tooling piece, it's a huge bridge right here. And especially with epoxy resins, you've got to try to eliminate all the undercuts that you can, because that thing just gets so full of resin. And if you string it and you push in there and come out of that, these nylons like to spring out. Your PVA bag just isn't strong enough to hold all that in. And boom, you'll get a huge amount of air. One reason why you need to make sure that you string tie these in that ring area. The other reason, if you do nylons first and you put the composite on there next, the composite never gets in underneath here. It just bridges like the nylon. And when you're done laminating and you take this thing apart, you can look inside of it and you'll see nothing but daylight resin right here. There'll be no composite or anything really holding this into place like it should be. What I like to do, and it's also for the face of this tooling because we don't need all these layers on top of this. I'll go ahead and pick this. I nip my nylon, remove this little flag. What I'll do is bring that around that tooling piece, let it flip in behind it there, no problem. Now I know I'm going to get nice resin pull up underneath there. Go right around that. Now, that's helped relax that nylon in through here. So since we're putting another layer on, I'm not going to tie this off yet. I'll do my next layer. This is nice and relaxed. My second layer, I'm definitely going to put a string around here. If my offset is really great on the end of my lock and I'm getting a big bridge here, I will take a string underneath here and tie this in also, so I don't get a big bridge on a huge offset. Another place for resin to pool up. All right. Okay, now we'll deflect this one back. All right, get this nice and snug. Back to the same thing. I want to remove a little of this off the face. It doesn't do us any good. Doesn't change the strength of our layup. If anything, it helps it more than it hurts it. Pull all that excess around my tooling. Let that just slide right in behind there. Let's go ahead and help this out a little more. This is one of those areas that can become a big problem. We're right in that groove area, close enough, because we got it full of Coyote Quick, but we're in there tight enough. You won't see it from the inside of the lamination because we're staying above the finished socket area. If this was Caucasian, I probably would use a white thread instead of black, just in case it shows up anywhere. I don't want to see that in my finish. Now, when you bring that video around, you can see how this is all pulled in here. There's no puckering except for right here. And if I thought that was too severe on an undercut, I'd go ahead and take my string, put it in my groove, and drop it below here and draw that in right here. In fact, we'll just do that and take a look at it and see how big of a difference that can make. So we'll go just below that groove and just underneath like that. Go one more time around underneath that one shot as close as we can get. So now we'll spin this around, and now you can actually see the offset, how it's sticking out, but we took a lot of bridging out of there. This is going to be a lot easier for the bag to draw in. We won't have near the pooling of resin right there. You kind of see how that's just barely puckering now. All right, so now we're getting ready to put our braid over and deflect, and our braid will be our finish, our exterior of our socket. The braid will be the finish. If this was reverse and the braid went on and then we had nylons over it to white it out, my reinforcement would be done in a little different manner. But since we're going to that next, now is the time to lay in your reinforcement strips. And we're going to use a 1-inch carbon tape and just come up around the lock. Give it a little shot of spray glue to hold still. And lay it right in that groove that's provided. Lay it down the side of the body, try not to leave any creasings. We'll twist this in behind where our lever is. I'm going to push it in my groove a little bit here. So when my next layer goes on, I can find that channel easier. Make sure I can find my channel on this side. Yep, it's in there. So when this gets sanded away and taken off, we'll still have strength coming around here and back down to the socket. Tuck that up underneath, set it down, lay it around. Come around here, there's our groove. I'm gonna go ahead and mist this just a little bit. All right, now we're ready for our braid. We're just gonna cover that lock. I don't need this real long coverage on this, but 2 layers over your connector and your lock is recommended, highly recommended by our office. You know you've got enough strength to hold that on there. Push that braid up in around there and you can see how that braid really conforms and shows up our undercut where our tooling piece is. The PVA bag will have no trouble drawing in. We'll have no trouble stringing that and getting that bulk resin out of our way. We can find our groove through here, right there. Get our next piece deflected. Get our tie-off point. Beautiful. Beautiful. This is a 6-inch braid. The 5 wasn't bad. Going over it was a little bit tight down through the belly, so I went to a 6. PVA bag will easily pull this in right here. Let's get our lamination plate on top here. We don't want to pull a bag over this and fill our screw holes full of resin. So we've got our Coyote Quick lamination plate and my number 18 screws that come with it. And I want to put a little compound 4 on them. And epoxy resins hold things together a lot harder than modifieds. A little bit of that compound 4 works great. Wax, whatever you like to use with your laminating. And we'll just bring those down snug. Any excess compound 4, we'll just smear it around on top of that. One other thing I like to do, I go ahead and clay in my holes where my screw heads are. Now you can't pull a PVA bag over it right now. Me personally, I like to put on a vacuum nylon just to make it easier to go over, and a nylon over any kind of plastic like this is nice. But I would do this whether I use that glue plate or not. I don't want to have to pull that PVA bag over. And in fact, once we get done laminating this, you'll never even be able to tell that this nylon was on here. If you look hard enough, you can see it, but man, it is tough to tell, especially after the leg's been worn for a little while. It's just so thin that it doesn't show. Same old deal. Get your bag on where you're comfortable with it. Nice and snug over that distal end so it draws in good. Go ahead and tie this off with my bird cage. All right, since we are using epoxy resin, I've got my vacuum up around 22 to 23 pounds, which seems to work really well. The epoxy resins, not too strong of a draw and it's not too light. It helps pull that heavier viscosity resin down into your lamination real nice. And that looks good. Now let's try some vacuum here. And you can see how that just draws that right in. So today we're going to use the ER. You can also use Fabtex epoxy resin for this application to get a sealed tight socket. Elevated vacuum. Other companies I talk to, that's exactly what they're using. Some companies are using ER. All right, resin's mixed, sit on the bench for a minute, got all the bubbles out of it. Got vacuum on our bag. We are using an epoxy resin, same old deal. Don't get in a big hurry when you first introduce it, because you have all those thick layers. All that braiding and everything is much thicker on this distal end. You just kind of want it to take its time. Let it slowly work into all of that. Keep from air pooling, getting trapped. You just barely coax it around. Have to be a lot more patient with epoxy resins. From the time it takes to cure to the way you start with them. All right, we'll kind of massage that in. There, see, that's much better than when it's bridged. So I know when I'm done, I'm gonna have composite up to the base of that lock, and I have a nice solid base in a 360 circle, not just halfway around or 3/4 of the way around. I worked that over with my hand a little bit. Now I'm not seeing any more air. All my undercuts are looking good. Now we can introduce a little more resin. We don't have a lot of thick layers, so we can move a little faster. If you've got nylon stockinette and a lot more layers of material, you just can't be fast with this stuff. You have to take your time and introduce it so it saturates it and doesn't jump through it so quick that it leaves air pockets in it. We're gonna go ahead and do this with just straight epoxy today. We're not gonna put any coloring in it. We'll see what our braid looks like when we're done. Have a good visual of what that braid looks like. We'll be able to see where our deflect is, exactly where it's at and where it's not. All right, we strung most of that by hand. Work down through our lock a little bit. That undercut looks really good on this side. It's laying in there real nice with the bag. Get right up underneath there and pull that out. Now, if we had that bridge in there and I shoved that string in and pulled that out, I guarantee you that would just pop back out flat and there'd be huge amounts of air in it. There it is. The whole thing on that lateral wall is saturated. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce a little more resin and then string it to about 3/4 point, and then I'm going to warm it up with the heat gun, kind of break the viscosity down, and string it again. And then I'll tape off my top, then I'll string that excess out, and then I'll warm it and string it all the way to the end, and we'll walk away from it. The upsides to the epoxies is you don't have the hazmat issues. That saves you on your freight. They're much nicer to work with. The odor value on them is almost non-existent compared to everything else that we use. The other part of it is once you give it to a patient, after it's set, you've cut it out, trimmed it, you can get them something that doesn't smell like resin within a day or two. I'm going to warm this up a little bit, just enough to string it out a little thinner. We're going to leave this under our full vacuum, 20 to 23 pounds. One of the keys from the companies that I talked to that's laminating over Surlyn, and I brought this up earlier, and that was letting this epoxy cure out as much as you can. It's just like a glue trying to bond to plastic. And if the glue isn't completely dry and you start cutting on it, it'll peel away. Just like glue does when we glue a pad in. If the glue isn't tacked up, it won't stick. And you can feel that warmth in that. It's stringing out completely different now. You can really work that down. I'm using a parachute cord and I'm working it pretty aggressively. I've yet to have a drying issue doing this method, or starving out issues. If you think you're going to have them on this lateral wall, just bring it down close to your proximal brim and stop. You've got plenty of time to keep working it. All right, on this one, I'll go ahead. I'm going to tape right around my lamination plate. Pull it fairly snug, get right across the top of that tooling piece. Catch any excess resin. Start working myself over here where my undercut's at. My offset undercut. Just push that in with my thumb, and as I'm doing that, you can see the resin coming out from underneath there. This also gives you one last chance to check for air doing this, because now we're going to hold this in there nice and snug. We're not going to allow that PVA bag to do all the work, pull away from us. Now we're underneath of that tooling piece. You can really see the resin that can bring out of there. If you do this correctly, you won't get any roping effect on the end of your lock. And if you're afraid of that, do this, put it on there. About the time it's set up to where it feels like it's not moving, you can always pull your tape off, keep that from burning tape lines in there. But part of the key to that is keeping good bag tension up here on your distal, so that way when you do tape it, you don't get bag wrinkling on you. Now look at all this resin that we found. That's quite a bit. We'll just dump that in our waste area and leave it. Just double check this whole thing one more time. We got a nice warm lab today, so I think I'm going to quit with my stringing. If it was cooler in here, I'd probably take my heat gun and warm it up one more time and restring all of it. That tape's on there nice and snug, so this thing won't spring back on me and suck air into it. That feels good. It doesn't feel real thick. I can see the contours real well, so I know I'm in good shape there. That's about as good as you're going to get that. All right, so our next step is let this cure, and then we'll cut it off and do our vacuum test. And we better get elevated vacuum that holds and have no leakage. That's the way it's supposed to work.